The date was April 18, 1943. High above the Solomon Islands, a formation of 16 P-38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron sliced through the tropical sky at 12,000 feet. Their mission was unlike any other. Intercept and destroy Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, whose transport was en route to Bougainville. The ambush succeeded. Yamamoto's aircraft plunged into the jungle below, marking one of the most daring targeted assassinations in military history. But what the American pilots couldn't have known that day was that within months, a secret weapon would emerge that would render even the most precise aerial interception obsolete for certain targets. A weapon that didn't require a direct hit. A weapon that would revolutionize anti-aircraft warfare and change the face of the Pacific War forever. This weapon was the proximity fuse, officially designated the VT fuse, where VT stood for variable time, though this was merely a cover name to disguise its true nature. The reality was far more extraordinary. This was a miniature radar set, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, intelligent enough to detect an aircraft and detonate at the optimal killing distance. It was a marriage of physics, engineering, and desperation that would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II, rivaling even the Manhattan Project in its strategic importance. The story of the proximity fuse begins not with triumph, but with crisis. In the years leading up to America's entry into World War II, military planners watched with growing alarm as the German Luftwaffe demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of strategic bombing over Britain. The Battle of Britain, which raged from July to October 1940, exposed a brutal reality. Conventional anti-aircraft defenses were woefully inadequate. British gunners firing standard time-fused shells, projectiles that detonated at a preset altitude, achieved a hit rate so abysmal that it required an estimated 20,000 shells to bring down a single aircraft. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At such expenditure rates, no nation could produce enough ammunition to defend its cities, its fleets, or its armies from air attack. The fundamental problem was one of precision. A conventional anti-aircraft shell traveled at supersonic speed toward a target moving at 300 miles per hour or more, often through cloud cover, at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet. The gunner had to calculate the target's altitude, speed, and direction, then set a mechanical time fuse that would detonate the shell at the precise moment it reached the predicted position. In practice, this meant the shell had to explode within a sphere roughly 30 feet in diameter to inflict fatal damage. Miss by 50 feet, and the aircraft sailed through unscathed. It was like trying to hit a speeding car from 2 miles away while blindfolded. The United States Navy understood this problem with particular urgency. As tensions with Japan escalated throughout 1940 and 1941, American naval strategists recognized that any Pacific war would be dominated by carrier-based aviation. The Japanese had already demonstrated their proficiency in this domain with devastating strikes against Chinese targets. If war came, American battleships and carriers would face swarms of enemy aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, attacking in coordinated waves. The survival of the fleet depended on creating an effective air defense umbrella, and the existing tools were simply inadequate. In the summer of 1940, a small group of scientists and engineers at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, a research facility operated by the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., began exploring a radical solution. Led by physicist Merle Tuve, this team included some of America's brightest minds: Richard Roberts, Lawrence Hafstad, and later, engineers from the National Bureau of Standards and the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Their goal was audacious: create a fuse that could sense its proximity to a target and detonate automatically, without human intervention or mechanical timing mechanisms. The theoretical foundation had existed for years. Scientists understood that radio waves could be used to detect distant objects. This was the basis of the radar systems already being developed in Britain and America. But radar installations were enormous, requiring rooms full of equipment, massive antennas, and dedicated power supplies generating thousands of watts. The challenge facing Tuve's team was to miniaturize this technology to fit inside a 5-inch artillery shell that would experience forces of 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing, spin at 500 revolutions per second, and still function flawlessly in the split second before impact. The engineering obstacles seemed insurmountable. Electronic vacuum tubes of the era were fragile glass devices designed for laboratory or radio equipment. Subject them to the tremendous shock of cannon fire, and they would shatter instantly. The circuitry required precise calibration and multiple components: transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and trigger mechanism, all of which had to operate in an environment of extreme temperature fluctuation, humidity, and vibration. The power source had to be reliable yet safe, capable of activating in milliseconds, yet remaining inert during months of storage. And the entire package had to be manufactured by the tens of millions at reasonable cost. What made the challenge even more daunting was the requirement for absolute secrecy. If the enemy discovered the existence of proximity fuses, countermeasures could be developed: electronic jamming, altered attack profiles, or recovery and reverse engineering of unexploded shells. The weapon's effectiveness depended entirely on strategic surprise. This meant that even within the American military establishment, knowledge of the project would be compartmentalized to the smallest possible circle. Pilots flying combat missions would never know that such a weapon existed until the moment it saved their lives. By late 1940, as Britain endured the Blitz and American involvement in the war seemed increasingly inevitable, Merle Tuve's team was working around the clock. The National Defense Research Committee, chaired by Vannevar Bush, the architect of America's wartime scientific mobilization, designated the proximity fuse as one of the highest priority projects. Resources began flowing to the research effort. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University was established specifically to oversee development and testing. Industrial partners including Western Electric, Eastman Kodak, and Westinghouse were brought into the program, each tackling different aspects of the manufacturing challenge. The researchers experimented with multiple approaches. Early prototypes used photoelectric cells that would detect the shadow of an aircraft, but these proved unreliable in clouds or at night. Acoustic sensors were tested, but couldn't distinguish aircraft engines from the noise of the shell's own passage through the air. Magnetic sensors lacked sufficient range. The team kept returning to radio frequency detection as the most promising solution, despite its formidable technical hurdles. By early 1941, a critical breakthrough emerged. Engineers developed a ruggedized vacuum tube that could survive the violence of cannon fire. The key was redesigning the internal structure. The filaments and electrodes were supported by rigid ceramic insulators and packed with shock-absorbing materials. The tubes were tested by firing them from special air cannons, then subjected to increasingly brutal tests until they consistently survived. It was painstaking, exhaustive work, but gradually reliability improved. The basic operational principle was elegant in its simplicity. The fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter broadcasting at a frequency around 200 MHz. As the shell approached an aircraft, the radio waves reflected off the metal skin and returned to a receiver in the nose of the fuse. The frequency of the reflected signal would shift, the Doppler effect, indicating that the distance to the target was closing rapidly. When this return signal reached a predetermined strength, indicating the shell was within lethal range, an electronic circuit would trigger the detonator. The entire sequence occurred in a fraction of a second, far faster than any human reflexes. But making this work in practice required solving hundreds of subsidiary problems. The fuse had to be safe during handling and storage, arming itself only after the shell had traveled a safe distance from the gun. It needed to distinguish between an aircraft and the ground or ocean below. The battery had to activate reliably despite sitting dormant in ammunition magazines for months. The antenna had to be shaped to provide the correct detection pattern. Every component had to function across temperature ranges from Arctic cold to tropical heat. As 1941 drew to a close, with prototype fuses undergoing field testing at the Navy's proving grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia, the world changed forever. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack that killed over 2,000 Americans and crippled the Pacific Fleet. The United States was now at war, and the proximity fuse was no longer an experimental research project. It was a critical weapon that could determine the outcome of the conflict. The race was on. American industry mobilized to produce these miniature technological marvels in massive quantities. But first, they had to prove themselves in combat. The question remained, would this revolutionary weapon work as intended when lives hung in the balance? The answer would come in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, above the dark waters of the Pacific, where American ships faced the most determined and skilled enemy aviators in the world. The first operational proximity fuses arrived in the Pacific Theater in January 1943, loaded aboard heavy cruisers of the United States Navy with instructions so classified that even the ship's captains were initially unaware of what made these new shells so special. The ammunition was designated Mark 32, a seemingly innocuous designation for 5-inch anti-aircraft rounds that looked almost identical to conventional shells except for the distinctive bulbous nose that housed the revolutionary radio fuse. Security protocols were draconian. If a ship faced imminent capture, these shells were to be destroyed immediately, even before classified documents. The crews firing them were told only that these were new experimental rounds, and were forbidden from discussing their performance, even with fellow sailors. The weapon's first true test came on January 5, 1943, during the Guadalcanal campaign, when the heavy cruiser USS Helena engaged Japanese aircraft attacking American positions. Fire control men loaded the Mark 32 shells into the 5-inch batteries, set the fuses to arm after 3 seconds of flight, and tracked incoming bogies on radar. When the enemy aircraft entered range, the Helena's guns opened fire. What happened next stunned the gun crews. Japanese aircraft began exploding in midair with shocking efficiency, even though the shells weren't making direct contact. One veteran gunner's mate later recalled, "We couldn't believe what we were seeing. Aircraft just started falling out of the sky. We thought maybe we'd gotten incredibly lucky, but it kept happening with every salvo." The performance exceeded even the optimistic projections of the weapon's designers. Analysis of the engagement showed that the proximity-fused shells achieved a kill rate approximately 3 times higher than conventional time-fused ammunition. Where it had previously required thousands of rounds to bring down a single aircraft, the new shells were achieving kills with dozens of rounds. The implications were staggering. Not only were ships now capable of defending themselves far more effectively, but the ammunition expenditure required to maintain fleet air defense dropped dramatically, solving critical logistics problems that had plagued the Navy since the war began. But the true value of the proximity fuse revealed itself during the desperate naval battles that followed. On May 8, 1943, during operations in the Coral Sea region, the destroyer USS O'Bannon found itself under attack by a formation of 8 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, the twin-engine aircraft that Japanese naval aviation used for long-range strikes. These were veteran crews, survivors of months of combat, and they executed a textbook attack approach, coming in low and fast from multiple directions to split the destroyer's defensive fire. The O'Bannon's 5-inch guns swung toward the incoming threats, and the gun director system fed targeting data to the mounts. The first salvo of proximity-fused shells roared from the barrels at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. At 5,000 yards, the shells began detonating in black puffs of shrapnel as they sensed the approaching aircraft. The lead Betty disintegrated as fragments tore through its fuel tanks and wing structure. The second aircraft, attempting to evade, flew directly into the burst pattern of the third salvo and cartwheeled into the sea-trailing fire. Within 90 seconds, 5 of the 8 attackers had been destroyed, and the remaining 3 broke off, jettisoning their torpedoes prematurely and fleeing at maximum speed. The engagement demonstrated not just the lethality of the proximity fuse, but its psychological impact. Japanese pilots had learned through bitter experience how to survive anti-aircraft fire from conventional fuses, aggressive evasive maneuvers, high-speed approaches at wave-top height, and attacks from multiple vectors to overwhelm defenders. But the proximity fuse changed the calculus entirely. Now, even near misses were lethal. An aircraft didn't need to be in the exact position predicted by the fire control solution. Passing within 70 feet of a shell was sufficient to encounter a lethal sphere of shrapnel traveling at supersonic velocity. Lieutenant Commander Paul Ryan, the O'Bannon's executive officer, filed a combat report that captured the weapon's revolutionary nature. The enemy aircraft appeared confused by the accuracy of our fire. Their evasive maneuvers, normally effective against time-fused shells, seemed to have no effect. I observed 3 aircraft attempting violent jinking patterns only to fly directly into airbursts. The psychological effect on surviving enemy crews appeared significant. Their attack coordination broke down entirely after the first 2 aircraft were destroyed. By mid-1943, proximity-fused ammunition was being deployed across the Pacific Fleet, though still in limited quantities. Production at facilities operated by Eastman Kodak, Western Electric, and other contractors was ramping up, but the complexity of manufacturing meant that supply remained constrained. Priority was given to ships operating in forward areas where Japanese air attack was most likely. Carrier task forces, amphibious assault groups, and isolated surface action groups operating within range of enemy airfields. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to American sailors as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, provided the most dramatic demonstration of the proximity Fuze's capabilities. This massive carrier engagement saw the Japanese combined fleet launch over 400 aircraft against Task Force 58, the most powerful concentration of American naval aviation in the Pacific. The Japanese plan called for coordinated waves of attack aircraft to overwhelm the American combat air patrol and anti-aircraft defenses, allowing their bombers and torpedo planes to cripple the American carriers. What the Japanese didn't know was that nearly every major American ship in the task force was now equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, and the crews had months of experience using it. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached on the morning of June 19th, American radar detected them at 70 miles. F-6F Hellcat fighters from the carriers launched to intercept, but dozens of enemy aircraft penetrated the fighter screen and closed on the fleet. The anti-aircraft barrage that erupted was unlike anything previously seen in naval warfare. 5-inch guns on cruisers and destroyers opened fire at maximum range, filling the sky with precisely timed airbursts. 40mm Bofors guns added their weight of fire at intermediate ranges, and 20mm Oerlikon cannons engaged at close range. But it was the 5-inch batteries with proximity fuses that did the devastating work. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in clusters, some exploding in midair, others trailing flames and smoke as they spiraled into the sea. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb, a fighter pilot from USS Lexington who observed the battle from above, later described the scene. "I've never seen anything like it. The Japanese formations just disintegrated. You'd see a tight group of 6 or 8 aircraft flying in coordination, and then the black puffs would start appearing around them, and suddenly there'd be 3 aircraft falling, then 2 more, and the survivors would be breaking formation in panic. Our ships were putting up a wall of fire that nothing could penetrate. The statistics from the battle were extraordinary. Over the course of 2 days, Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 300 aircraft, roughly 75% of their attacking force. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, most lost to operational accidents rather than enemy action. While American fighter pilots and superior aircraft quality certainly contributed to this lopsided victory, post-battle analysis credited the proximity fuse with destroying at least 30% of enemy aircraft that reached the fleet, a kill rate that would have been impossible with conventional ammunition. But the weapon's impact extended far beyond simple kill statistics. The proximity fuse fundamentally altered Japanese tactical doctrine. After the Philippine Sea disaster, Japanese commanders realized that conventional attack methods, the carefully practiced formations and approach vectors that had served them well early in the war, were now suicidal. Pilot training manuals were hastily revised to emphasize ultra-low-level approaches, hoping to force American gunners to risk hitting their own ships with proximity-fused shells that might detonate when sensing the ocean surface or friendly vessels. This tactical adaptation had its own consequences. Flying at wavetop height limited visibility, increased fuel consumption, reduced bombing accuracy, and made aircraft more vulnerable to small-caliber automatic weapons fire. Japanese aviators found themselves trapped between deadly alternatives: fly high enough to attack effectively and face the proximity-fused 5-inch batteries, or fly low to avoid the larger guns and risk being shredded by the massed 40mm and 20mm weapons that protected every American ship. The psychological toll on Japanese aircrew was immense. Veteran pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Darwin raids, and the Coral Sea now faced a defensive system that seemed to anticipate their every move. The traditional calculus of naval air combat, accept 30 to 40% losses in exchange for crippling damage to enemy ships, no longer functioned when losses exceeded 70% and successful hits became increasingly rare. Japanese naval aviation, which had entered the war as perhaps the world's finest carrier-based striking force, was being systematically destroyed not just by superior American aircraft and pilots, but by a secret weapon that turned the sky itself into a killing field. By late 1944, American industry was producing proximity fuses at a rate exceeding 40,000 per day. The manufacturing process, once considered impossibly complex, had been streamlined through mass production techniques pioneered by American industry. Quality control was ruthless. Every fuse underwent multiple tests before being certified for combat use, because a single dud that fell into enemy hands intact could compromise the entire program. The production facilities themselves were heavily guarded, with workers required to sign non-disclosure agreements and forbidden from discussing their work even with family members. The weapon's success in the Pacific led to calls for its deployment in other theaters, but here the secrecy requirements created a strategic dilemma. In Europe, where combat occurred over land rather than ocean, there was significant risk that German forces might recover unexploded shells and reverse engineer the technology. The Allies had invested enormous resources and scientific talent into creating this advantage. Losing it through premature deployment in Europe could have catastrophic consequences. Nevertheless, the European theater would soon face a threat so severe that the proximity fuse's deployment became unavoidable. As 1944 drew to a close, a new menace appeared in the skies over England and Belgium, one that conventional anti-aircraft fire was almost completely ineffective against, and one that threatened to disrupt the entire Allied advance into Germany. The proximity fuse would face its greatest test not against manned aircraft, but against the world's first operational cruise missile, the V-1 flying bomb. If you found this deep dive into World War II history fascinating, please consider subscribing to the channel. We bring you forgotten stories from the war with the same level of detail and historical accuracy, bringing the past to life one video at a time. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode. The sound was distinctive and terrifying, a harsh, rattling pulse like a giant motorcycle engine echoing across the sky. When that sound suddenly stopped, people in London had approximately 15 seconds to take cover before the explosion. This was the V-1 Vergeltungswaffe, or vengeance weapon, Hitler's answer to Allied strategic bombing, a pilotless aircraft packed with 1,870 pounds of high explosives, launched from ramps in occupied France and aimed at British cities. Between June 1944 and March 1945, Nazi Germany launched over 10,000 V-1s against England, killing over 6,000 civilians and injuring nearly 18,000 more. The psychological impact was devastating. Unlike manned bombers that attacked at predictable intervals, the V-1s arrived at random throughout day and night, giving no warning except that dreadful engine sound. The V-1 presented a unique challenge to air defense systems. Flying at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, the flying bombs were faster than most fighters except the latest models, and their small size made them difficult targets. Conventional anti-aircraft fire proved remarkably ineffective. The time-fused shells that struggled to hit manned bombers were even less successful against the small, fast-moving robots. By July 1944, British defenses were managing to destroy only about 40% of incoming V-1s through a combination of fighter interception, barrage balloons, and anti-aircraft fire. The remaining 60% reached their targets, primarily London and the southern port cities crucial to the Allied supply chain. General Frederick Pyle, commander of Britain's anti-aircraft command, recognized that the V-1 threat required a revolutionary solution. He requested that the Americans provide proximity-fused ammunition for the anti-aircraft batteries defending southern England. This request created an intense debate within Allied command. General Dwight Eisenhower, supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, understood the strategic necessity. If the V-1 campaign succeeded in disrupting British ports or demoralizing the civilian population, it could jeopardize the entire Allied advance into Germany. Yet deploying the proximity fuse over land meant accepting the risk that German forces might recover an intact fuse and develop countermeasures, or even their own version of the weapon. The decision was made to proceed, but with extraordinary precautions. In August 1944, American ships delivered the first proximity-fused ammunition to British anti-aircraft units. The shells were distributed only to batteries positioned along the coast, where any duds would likely fall into the English Channel rather than on land where German commandos or sympathizers might recover them. Gun crews received special instructions. If a fuse failed to detonate, They were to report its approximate fall location immediately so Royal Navy vessels could search for and recover the unexploded round. The results were immediate and spectacular. On August 28, 1944, the coastal anti-aircraft batteries equipped with proximity fuses opened fire on incoming V-1s for the first time. Within hours, gun crews reported unprecedented success rates. Commander Sir Robert Hill, stationed with a heavy anti-aircraft battery near Dover, recorded in his log. First salvo fired at incoming robot at 0847 hours. Target destroyed at range of 3,200 yards. Second target engaged at 0912 hours, destroyed at 4,100 yards. Third target engaged at 1,034 hours, destroyed at 2,800 yards. The new ammunition performs exactly as briefed. Every near miss is achieving kills. Morale among the gun crews is extraordinarily high. Within 2 weeks, the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire against V-1s increased from 40% to 79%. By September, with crews gaining experience and more batteries receiving proximity-fused ammunition, the success rate climbed above 90%. The V-1 campaign, which had terrorized southern England throughout the summer, was effectively neutralized. Those flying bombs that managed to penetrate the coastal defenses still faced fighter interception and the inner ring of defenses around London, but the proximity fuse had transformed the outer defensive belt from a permeable screen into an almost impenetrable barrier. The Germans never discovered why their V-1 offensive suddenly became ineffective. Intelligence reports from Nazi rocket scientists and air defense analysts, recovered after the war, showed they attributed the increased losses to improved radar-directed fire control or enhanced fighter tactics. Even when British forces recovered unexploded V-1s that had been engaged by proximity-fused shells, showing clear evidence of shrapnel damage from airbursts, German investigators failed to deduce the existence of the proximity fuse. This intelligence failure was partly due to German technological assumptions. Their own attempts to develop proximity fuses had foundered on the problem of creating vacuum tubes that could survive artillery firing, leading them to conclude such a weapon was impossible with existing technology. As Allied forces advanced across Europe in late 1944 and early 1945, the proximity fuse found new applications beyond anti-aircraft defense. American artillery commanders discovered that the fuses were devastatingly effective as airburst weapons against infantry and light vehicles. A conventional artillery shell had to score a direct hit or land close enough for ground fragments to cause casualties. Perhaps 90% of shells caused no casualties at all. But a proximity-fused shell would detonate 20 to 30 feet above the ground, creating a lethal radius of shrapnel that covered an area several times larger than a ground burst. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the first major ground combat test of this application. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, American artillery units found themselves facing massed infantry attacks and armored columns advancing through forests and rough terrain where conventional artillery fire was less effective. General George S. Patton's Third Army, racing north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, brought with it large stockpiles of proximity-fused 105mm and 155mm artillery shells. The impact on German forces was catastrophic. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment during the battle, later described the experience in his memoirs. We had faced American artillery many times before and developed tactics to minimize casualties, dispersed formations, rapid movement, exploitation of cover. But in the Ardennes, something had changed. Their shells began exploding above our positions before impact, creating a rain of steel fragments that penetrated even our scattered formations. Casualties from artillery fire increased dramatically. Men who had survived months of combat were cut down by an enemy they couldn't see, firing weapons that seemed to anticipate their every move. American artillery doctrine was revolutionized. Forward observers directing fire missions began calling specifically for VT fuse against area targets and infantry concentrations, reserving impact-fused shells for bunkers and fortified positions. The psychological effect paralleled what had been observed in naval combat. Enemy forces couldn't understand why American artillery had suddenly become so much more lethal. German tactical manuals from early 1945, captured by American intelligence, showed increasingly desperate attempts to counter the mysterious increase in artillery effectiveness, including recommendations to dig deeper foxholes and avoid clustering even in dispersed formations. The proximity fuse's contribution to Allied victory in Europe was quantified in post-war studies. The U.S. Army Operational Research Group estimated that proximity-fused artillery shells were approximately 4 times more effective than conventional shells against infantry targets, and the mere presence of proximity fuses in American artillery units reduced enemy willingness to maneuver in the open, constraining German tactical flexibility. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force credited the proximity fuse with shortening the war in Europe by several months and saving thousands of Allied lives. But it was in the Pacific theater that the proximity fuse achieved its most strategically significant results. As American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands in 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces prepared for a final, desperate defense. The concept of the kamikaze, deliberate suicide attacks by aircraft laden with explosives, represented Japan's response to overwhelming American air and naval superiority. If conventional attack methods could no longer succeed, perhaps suicide attacks, requiring only minimal pilot training and accepting 100% losses, could inflict sufficient casualties to force a negotiated peace. The kamikaze campaign began in earnest during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 and intensified throughout early 1945. These attacks were terrifyingly effective because they eliminated the survival instinct that made conventional pilots break off attacks when faced with heavy anti-aircraft fire. A kamikaze pilot would fly directly into the defensive barrage, accepting that he would likely be killed, betting that his burning aircraft would retain enough momentum to strike the target even as he died. Against conventional anti-aircraft fire, this meant that even mortally damaged aircraft often completed their final attack run. The proximity fuse changed this calculus fundamentally. When a kamikaze aircraft entered the defensive envelope of a ship equipped with proximity-fused ammunition, it had to survive not just accurate fire, but a continuous series of airbursts that created overlapping zones of shrapnel. An aircraft struck by fragments might not be immediately destroyed, but even minor damage, a punctured fuel tank, damaged control surfaces, or a wounded pilot, could cause the aircraft to crash short of its target or miss entirely. During the Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945, over 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched against the American fleet. This was the most intensive air attack ever faced by any naval force in history. Yet despite this unprecedented assault, the proximity fuse-equipped fleet defenses achieved remarkable results. While kamikaze attacks did sink or damage numerous ships, the overall success rate was far lower than Japanese planners had hoped. American analysis estimated that without proximity fuses, kamikaze effectiveness would have been 3 to 4 times higher, potentially resulting in losses severe enough to force a halt to offensive operations. Captain Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding the destroyer screen during Okinawa, filed a report that captured the weapon's importance. The kamikaze attacks are the most intense combat experience any American sailor has faced. The enemy displays fanaticism and skill in equal measure, and conventional defensive measures are insufficient. The proximity fuse is not just another weapon. It is the weapon that makes fleet operations in these waters survivable. Without it, I believe we would have faced losses on the scale of the Royal Navy at Jutland or worse. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American industry had produced over 22 million proximity fuses. These miniature marvels, each containing 5 vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, a battery, a radio transmitter and receiver, and explosive components, all packed into a package weighing less than 2 pounds and costing approximately $18 to manufacture, had fundamentally altered the nature of anti-aircraft warfare. The weapon remained classified top secret until after the war ended, and even then, full technical details weren't declassified until the 1950s. The proximity fuse's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The technological principles pioneered during its development, miniaturization of electronics, ruggedly designed vacuum tubes, mass production of precision components, laid groundwork for the post-war electronics revolution. Engineers who worked on the proximity fuse project went on to leadership roles in the development of transistors, integrated circuits, and eventually microprocessors. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, established specifically to develop the proximity fuse, became one of America's premier research institutions, continuing to work on defense technology for decades. Vannevar Bush, who had overseen the Proximity Fuze program as director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, later ranked it among the 3 most important technological developments of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, stated in 1945 that the Proximity Fuze contributed more to the defeat of Germany and Japan than any other single weapon. This was remarkable praise for a device that most Americans had never heard of and wouldn't learn about for years after the war ended. The weapon also represented a new paradigm in warfare: the integration of sophisticated electronics into conventional munitions to create smart weapons that could make autonomous decisions in microseconds. This concept, a weapon that could sense its environment and adapt its behavior without human intervention, was revolutionary in the 1940s and foreshadowed the precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, and autonomous systems that would define warfare in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, the Proximity Fuze achieved its strategic objectives while remaining almost completely secret from the enemy. German and Japanese intelligence services never penetrated the program, never captured intact fuses for study, and never developed effective countermeasures. This intelligence success was as important as the technological achievement itself, demonstrating that even in total war, secrets of enormous strategic value could be kept through rigorous operational security and disciplined compartmentalization. The men who fired proximity-fused ammunition in combat, the gunners on destroyers in the Pacific, the anti-aircraft crews defending London, the artillery forward observers in the Ardennes, rarely understood what made their weapons so effective. They simply knew that their shells were hitting targets with unprecedented reliability, and that their chances of survival had improved dramatically. It was only after the war, when the weapon was finally revealed to the public, that they learned they had been wielding one of the most sophisticated technological achievements of the 20th century. Today, the Proximity Fuze is largely forgotten outside specialist military and engineering circles, overshadowed by more dramatic developments like radar, jet aircraft, and nuclear weapons. Yet its impact on World War II was profound and measurable. Thousands of Allied lives saved, hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed, and multiple critical battles. The Philippine Sea, the V1 campaign, the kamikazes at Okinawa, decisively influenced by a weapon that most people never knew existed. It stands as a testament to the power of scientific innovation, industrial mobilization, and operational security working in concert to achieve strategic advantage in the most consequential conflict in human history. The Proximity Fuze story reminds us that wars are won not just by courage and numbers, but by the application of human intelligence to solve seemingly impossible problems. In 1940, creating a miniature radar set that could survive artillery firing, cost less than $20, and function flawlessly in combat seemed like science fiction. By 1945, American industry was producing 40,000 of them every day. That transformation, from impossible to routine in less than 5 years, encapsulates both the technological achievement and the industrial miracle that defined America's role in World War II. Before we close, I want to encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already. We work hard to bring you these detailed, historically accurate stories from World War II, and your subscription helps us continue this mission. Also, hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. We have dozens more incredible stories waiting to be told. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.